Thanks. First of all, let me just say this is a very fuzzy subject, national competitiveness, and there's not much agreement about it. Let me just recite a few indexes here and then go and talk a little bit about the subject. So the World Economic Forum is famous, among other things, for keeping its competitiveness index of a couple of hundred countries. I've actually even worked on it over the years. The list is, and I'll read it from best, most competitive country to least on the top 10. And that it begins with Switzerland, then Singapore, Sweden, Finland, USA, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, Japan, and UK. Those are the 10 most competitive countries in the world across a large number of measures. Now let me give you the growth rates where those countries stack with regard to the 200 and some odd countries in the world. Switzerland is number 134th. Singapore is one of the only anomalies because it's the second most competitive country. It's also the 8th fastest growing country in the world. Sweden, third most competitive, but 86th in terms of growth. Finland, fourth most competitive, 119th in terms of growth. USA, fifth most competitive, 159th in terms of growth. Germany, 120th in terms of growth. Netherlands, 150th. Denmark, and we're talking out of 200 countries. Denmark, 152nd. Japan, 178th. And the UK, 165th. Quickest growing country. So if you say, well, these are the 10 most competitive countries in the world, and they seem to cluster in the bottom 80 to almost 200 in terms of growth, we must not be asking the right questions with regard to what we mean by competitiveness, because the most competitive countries in the world during this difficult time are among the slowest growing countries in the world. So I'll just take this list and put it over there. The issue that most people talk about when they consider competitiveness are institutional. And we're talking then, and we do at the Milken Institute, we do a lot of studies on these institutional factors, but they include levels of corruption, the legal system, economic policy, accounting standards, the ability of the regulators to move in, education levels and attainment, tax policy, labor force flexibility, and so forth. These are all well-known institutional issues that make up the competitiveness. Now if you look at the list of competitive countries and so forth, they all score very highly on these indicators. And the issue with regard to Spain is that so does Spain. I mean, if we look at the institutional issues from a static perspective and say, well, how is the labor market in terms of flexibility? What are the educational attainment levels and so forth? Spain actually does quite well. There are areas that need reform, like every country, maybe on the tax side, education. We've heard a number of those issues already talked about. But the area that is really critical, I believe, and completely left out of this whole discussion is in a whole different sector. And that is, okay, these institutions in Spain, there are a lot of highly educated people, there are a lot of the tax policies probably too rigid, probably too high and across the board, especially with regard to taxes on labor, but they're within the realm of competitive countries. They're not crazy, and they're not certainly the kinds of rules and regulations that should leave a country with 50% youth unemployment and so forth. So, but there is a critical piece, and as I say, it's not on most of the indexes that relate to competitiveness, and that is access to capital. And if you look at that issue and say, well, take these institutions, take the human capital that we have, the training levels and education levels that we have, how does it look from the standpoint of access to capital? And now the situation is very different. In terms of access to capital, Spain is down in about 34th position. And we measure this, and we see that Canada is #1 in terms of access to capital. Someone wants to go start a business or expand their business. Very easy in Canada to get capital. Hong Kong is #2. The UK is #3. Singapore is #4. US is #5. Switzerland is #6. Sweden is #7. Australia is 8. Netherlands 9. And Finland 10. That's in terms of how you get access to capital, whether or not it's easy or difficult, whether there are multiple sources of capital. Spain is down at 24. So it's much more difficult in Spain. Now you say, what is the reason for this? And I think in many ways, the countries that have the greatest access to capital also have the smallest participation in the economy of the banking sector. In other words, banks are wonderful institutions, and we thank the one, of course, who's invited us here. But they also, when they tend to dominate the financial structures of countries, they restrict the flow of capital and the access to capital. And this is a very difficult situation for companies to navigate through. If the only source of capital in a country are banks, then we're talking about long, cumbersome processes. We're talking about highly concentrated sources of capital rather than a wide array of capital. And we're talking about terms that can be onerous. In other words, it can be very difficult to finally get capital, whereas if you go to a venture capital or private equity, there are multiple ways. It's all a negotiation. There are mixes of equity and debt. There are all types of products and so forth that are possible. That's not possible in a country like Spain. So if I am an entrepreneur in Spain, and there are a lot of them, I think, having traveled around with Juan, meeting a lot of entrepreneurs, there are a lot of entrepreneurs, but they can't get access to capital. So the issue is, what do you do to get access to capital? And I'll just give you a couple of statistics. For example, this is before I'm going to get to the access to capital, but in the US, the banking sector is equal to 60% of GDP. In Europe, it's 110%, 110% of GDP, of Eurozone GDP. So banks dominate. And if you include foreign lending and so forth, they're larger than the GDP in terms of their participation overall in finance. The financial markets, larger than the GDP, whereas in the US it's 60%. Now Anthony mentioned some very interesting points in his intervention a couple of minutes ago, which I think actually, at least in my mind, put a lot of these issues together. And Svi mentioned not to waste a crisis. And I think if you think about why this has happened, in the 70s, as Anthony was saying, we had not only did we have a banking crisis, not only did we have a tremendous crisis in the US in terms of the markets, a 10-year bear market, plus the destruction of the fixed commission rules. So you had a lot of bankruptcies in the capital markets, participants, brokerage houses, and so forth. But you also had a currency crisis at the same time in the 70s when the dollar did away with the final linkage to gold in 1971. So we had a very significant set of crises. Now, what was done to prevent that crisis from spilling out and ruining the rest of the economy? And the answer is nothing, which was exactly the right answer, because suddenly you had a brokerage houses with a lot of experienced people out of work. And what did they do? They started venture capital firms at that time, they started private equity firms, and they started hedge funds, all of which were born in the crisis of the 1970s, the one that Zvi told us not to waste. And I think if you consider where we are at this particular point, where we have a heavily bank-oriented finance system in Europe, particularly in Spain, highly concentrated, where it's very difficult to get capital, where you do have talented, educated, technologically savvy people, we need to liberate that finance system from a very narrow hold by some very concentrated groups of lenders and make it a much more flexible system. So I would say, let's not pay so much attention to the structure of the labor marketplace. Let's pay more attention to the structure of the financial marketplace and to the varieties of opportunities and ways that capital can be purveyed so that entrepreneurs, which do exist, if you believe people are unhappy, you have entrepreneurs. These people want to start businesses. We need to figure out ways to create the structures so that they can get the capital they need. Thanks.